Hey guys, this is Kind. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be hopefully a really informative one. I want to take a deep dive. Well, really it's not a deep dive, it's sort of just scratching the surface, but this video is going to be all about the basics of understanding a sewing machine. Now there's industrial, like commercial sewing machines out there that are attached to an entire table. This is one of the portable home sewing machines that most of us have if we're just amateurs. And so I do want to preface this video by saying I'm no professional, I'm not a seamstress. Everything I've learned is kind of just from experience and trial and error. So I'm sort of making this as the video that I wish I had when I was starting to learn how to sew. As I said, I'm really not that experienced at all. I only have this machine to refer to, so I really can't recommend to you different kinds of sewing machines. All I have is this one that I can talk about. So I'm not going to recommend this because I don't know what else is out there and what else might be a better bang for your buck. I think I paid around $300 for this. I've had it for about 2 years. The model is a Singer 4423. And this video is not sponsored, by the way, just to make that fully clear. I think $300, somewhere around that range, is a good amount of money to spend on a sewing machine if you're just starting out and you want something that can last you a long time and that can still be really useful to you even when you do start to level up and get a little bit better at it. The only negative thing I'll say about this machine is that it has an automatic needle threader that has a little hook that grabs onto your thread and pulls it through the eye of the needle. But that got misaligned, it doesn't work anymore, so I have to manually thread the needle. That's the only thing that I don't like about this, but other than that, I think it has all of the basic elements that every machine should have, which I'm gonna get into. It comes attached with 2 wires that are sort of connected in one, so this plugs into the machine, and then we have a foot pedal, and I press my foot on this, and that's what moves the needle. In the time that it would take you or I to sew something by hand with a needle and thread and make a long stitch, a sewing machine can do in a matter of seconds, and it can do so many more stitches than we can do, making the seam much stronger than we could ever do by hand. The disadvantage is that when we're sewing something by hand, we can really be flexible with our hands and we can shift the fabric around the needle and really get in there, but a machine can't do that because the needle only goes up and down and up and down and up and down. So a sewing machine will actually have a top thread and a bottom thread, and it will loop the threads together to create the stitch. Your number one resource for working with your machine is going to be the instruction manual. I've had this guy for 2 years. I still always come back to the instruction manuals, especially to troubleshoot it or if I'm trying something different. Not only does this help you set up the machine and tell you how to thread the needle, the top and the bottom, it also has lots of information about working with different kinds of materials, what kind of needles you can use. So I'm not going to tell you how to set up your machine because, of course, every model is different. I've chosen purple up top and red in the bottom so I can sew for you guys some example stitches and you'll really see how it works. Right here, I've got this square of muslin. There's 2 layers of it. Muslin is just a very cheap fabric. It's often used for patterning. Doesn't stretch very much at all. You can't see it right now, but underneath the table, I've got the foot pedal right underneath my foot. So I'm gonna press the machine on, and you can see a little light bulb turns on right there. In order for me to slide this fabric under the needle, 2 things have to be lifted up. The foot, which is this flat plate right here, and that's controlled by this lever back here. Also, the needle has to be up. If the needle is down, then I can't get anything underneath it. And the needle is controlled not only by the foot pedal, but this hand wheel off to the side. This allows you to control it with some more precision. So you see how the needle is going up and down? I'm twisting the hand wheel so that the needle is up. I'm going to slide my fabric underneath the needle like so. Push the pressure foot down, and I also like to push the needle down as well. So this wheel right here tells you what kind of stitch you're going to do. So you can see those lines, meaning a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. The reason that there's a black and a blue pattern is because the blue means it's a stretch stitch. A stretch stitch goes 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. So I'm going to select a stitch length about, let's say, 3. And I'm going to select a straight stitch, which is the most basic kind. If I zoom out a little bit, this wheel right here, you can't see it, but it's labeled width up here. This is the width of the stitch. This is only really relevant if you're going to do a zigzag stitch, but since we're going to be doing a straight stitch, I'm going to set it to a width of 0. This wheel right here is needle position. This wheel right here is tension, which I know is sort of a dreaded setting for lots of people, but I'll show you a little bit later what tension does. So I've got us on a straight stitch, a length of 3, a width of 0, and I'm going to start pressing on my foot pedal. And underneath this presser foot, there's these little teeth that act as a conveyor belt, so it automatically moves the fabric forward without me even pushing it through. But I like to hold on to it still. I'll lift the presser foot up, and then you kind of have to pull on the excess thread and snip it off. So this is the stitch we've ended up with. You can see there's purple on the top and red on the bottom. So these threads are sort of loose, huh? I can cut them shorter. When we sew things by needle and hand, we often like to tie the knots off in the beginning and end to keep the thread from coming unloose. But a machine like this doesn't do that, unless you have one that's very fancy and computerized. So let me try again. And this time when I start and end my stitch, I'm gonna go back and forth with the reverse stitch. So lightly, I'm gonna press on my foot pedal, move it forward a couple of stitches, and then I'm gonna hold down on this reverse tab. And when I press on my presser foot now, it's gonna move backwards. Forwards and backwards, and forwards and backwards. And forward to continue the stitch. Then when I reach the end, I'll go backwards, and forwards and backwards. You only really need to do it once or twice. You don't need to do it as many times as I just did. I was kind of just being dramatic. So I'll do it again beside it to show you how I really would do it. Just once usually is enough. And what that does is by going forwards and backwards, doing a reverse stitch at the beginning and end, it just reinforces that stitch and acts like a knot that will keep it in place. So then you can just cut it loose from the end. And then that seam will have a harder time coming undone. So now that we can do the straight stitch, let's experiment a little bit with a zigzag stitch. So I'm gonna turn my dial here to the zigzag stitch right there. I'm gonna keep the length at about a 3, and I'm gonna change the width to, let's say, a 4. I mean, the farthest this goes is 6, so I think a 4 is a good place in the middle. Now with the zigzag stitch, it's a little bit harder to hide your business, especially when you're doing those reverse stitches. It's a lot more obvious. I'll zoom you guys in a little bit more here, and notice how the needle goes side to side, right? Now let's see the difference by changing the width to the 6, which is the longest width. And now the needle moves as much side to side as it possibly can. See how these zigzags are much wider? This was with a width of 6, and this was with a width of 4. If you really want the zigzags big, maximize the length and the width at the same time, and then you'll get zigzags that are very wide and very far apart. Like that. Whereas if I set the width to, say, 1, set the length to 1, see? It's a lot slower. So why would you select one of these stitches over one of the other stitches? Well, a lot of times it's about just the aesthetic and what you want it to look like on your garment. Say I'm sewing together pieces of trims and thin ropes, and I want to encapsulate them all with thread, then I'll choose something with a wider stitch length because I really want that needle to move far to both the left and the right sides to encapsulate something maybe. If I'm sewing something and I don't have much seam allowance, maybe I'll choose something that's a little bit thinner, like what's at the top. So that's how width comes into play, but how about length? Well, when the stitches are very close together, I tend to think of it as it's more reinforced, there's more stitches in there holding it together, whereas stitches that are very far apart are, you can see them as a little bit weaker, but what if you're sewing with something like leather that you don't really want to pierce holes into? Then you want to use as little punches of the needle as possible. All of these things come into mind when you're choosing what type of stitch and what type of width and length you're going to use. But for most basic garments, I tend to just use a straight stitch, and I tend to just use a length of about 2 to 3. I think that is a pretty good default if you don't know what you're really doing. If you have a zigzag stitch and a straight stitch on your sewing machine, then there's a lot you can accomplish with that. I mean, even with those two stitches, you can do a top stitch, an edge stitch, a French seam. There's so much you can do with it that lots of these stitches on this wheel are really just decorative. You know, I work a lot on my channel with stretch fabric, so let's take a minute to talk about how different types of stitches can affect the stretch and preserve the stretch of your fabric. So this is some spandex fabric. People also call it Lycra, which is just a brand name. But this is some stretch fabric that I used for a dance costume on my channel. Let's say we're trying to sew this up with a straight stitch. So let me select my straight stitch. Let me choose a length of about 3, set the width to 0, and get to sewing with our straight stitch. Do the reverse stitch to secure it at both ends. If this is the regular stretch of the fabric down here, can I really stretch it on my straight stitch? No, it doesn't really stretch that much. It doesn't stretch as much as it could, right? So the straight stitch kind of steals away your stretching power. Now let's try sewing on a zigzag stitch. I'm gonna keep it at a length of 3, and I'll change it to a width of about 4. And again, I'm gonna start going, reverse, forward, reverse. Now if we compare, the zigzag stitch allows it to stretch a lot because look, those threads are sort of stretching like accordions. If you're watching my costume tutorials where I'm using stretch fabric, I often say to sew with a zigzag stitch, and this is precisely the reason why. A third type of stitch that you may have heard me talk about is a stretch stitch. Now, I used to think my machine didn't have this until I looked into my instruction manual, and the problem was I was looking in this little dial for the stretch stitch, but actually the stretch stitch is up here because it's related to the straight stitch. So I'll set my machine to a straight stitch and turn my length to S1, which is that blue guy right there. And I'll set the width back to 0. A stretch stitch will go 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. So the needle goes down 3 times, makes 3 stitches, but you've only moved 1 step forward. So this stitch is very slow. And because of how it does that, I don't do the whole starting off and ending with a reverse stitch, going forward, back, because every other stitch goes forward and back. So if you look very carefully, my fabric is jitting forward and back and forward and back and forward and back. And if you look at it, it looks at first glance like it's a straight stitch, but because it goes forward and back and forward and back, you can actually stretch it quite a bit. So when it comes to stretching stretch fabrics, let me say that again. When it comes to sewing with stretch fabrics, straight stitch, probably a no-go. Zigzag stitch is more accessible, it's very easy to understand, it's much faster. The stretch stitch looks much cleaner because it almost resembles a straight stitch. So it looks a lot less messy, but it takes a lot more time because it takes triple the amount of time to get from point A to point B. By the way, you guys, this might come off as obvious, but my foot pedal that I'm pressing on, it is sensitive to pressure, so if you press on it lightly, the needle is going to move slowly. If you press on it fast, if you're really comfortable with things and you're sewing in one big long straight line, then the needle moves very fast. There's a little dial up here to adjust the sensitivity of the pressure foot if you really think it needs to be more sensitive. If you think it's way too sensitive, you want to be able to apply more pressure. I recommend going very slowly. A lot of times some fabrics, especially some stuff like sequins, stuff like even the spandex fabric, they can get caught in the needle really easily, so I recommend to go really slowly. And if you are sewing with a fabric like a sequin that has a chance of hurting the needle, if I come to a stall, I'll use the hand pedal to move very, very slowly the needle. And if it's not going to press down at all, if it's hit a really hard part of the fabric, then you don't want to force it. You want to adjust it with your hands, move it through. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about in this video is your tension, which I've really only started learning about very recently. I feel like every amateur sewing enthusiast just totally avoids this dial at all costs. A great way to learn about how this works is to try sewing at the different extremes. Get yourself some scrap fabric that you don't care about and set it to the extreme dials of the tension to see what it does. And that's precisely the reason why I've put a purple thread up here and a red thread down there, because the way tension works is it has everything to do with how the top and the bottom threads interact. I'm gonna set mine to the lightest tension we can get, which is 0, and I'm gonna sew on a straight stitch with a length of 3 and a width of 0. There's what that stitch looks like. Looks pretty regular, right? But in order for us to get any understanding out of this, let's compare it to the other extreme. So I'm going to set my dial to a tension of 9, which is the total other extreme, which is a lot of tension. All right, so this top row was a tension of 0. This bottom one was the tension of 9. The first thing I notice, if I take this at an angle, the fabric is no longer flat, because you see these very subtle wrinkles and ruching along this bottom row. That's because this thread is so tight that it's causing the fabric to ruche and causing it to gather and wrinkle. See, if I turn it around, all of these wrinkles that are happening around this bottom row. Here, I only see purple. Here, I'm seeing purple with dots of red. Do you see that? Here, I'm seeing red with these subtle dots of purple. But here, I'm seeing only red. It's very subtle, but do you see these purple dots? That's because the purple thread at a tension of 0 is so loose, it's allowing the red thread to pull it to the back. Whereas the purple thread, the purple is our top thread is so tight at a tension of 9 that it's pulling the red thread forward. Let's look at it from an angle again. See how at a tension of 0, the purple thread is sort of bubbling? It looks like there are those little loops and bumps. Whereas down here, it looks like it's just one continuous string. Flip it over, and I see the opposite case. This red thread is sort of bubbling because the purple is pulling it to the other side, whereas the red thread here looks just continuous. If you look at my machine, this is the tension dial. There's a 0, and when it gets to 3, there is this line that goes all the way to 5. Because most sewing projects happen between a tension of 3 and 5. Just like width and length and stitch type, there is no correct setting to use in all scenarios because it depends on what you're doing. Think about if this was a very, very delicate fabric. These wrinkles and ruching that you see here, it's subtle on this fabric, but if the fabric was very, very lightweight and very delicate, these wrinkles would be 10 times more extreme, 10 times more obvious. And so I should use a lower tension if I'm using a very lightweight fabric. If I'm using a very heavy fabric that has lots of structure to it, that has lots of weight on it, why am I going to use a loose stitch on it? How is that going to hold things together? It all depends on what you're sewing with. Are you using denim? Are you using leather? Are you using chiffon, tulle? Ideally, you want something that's sort of going to be in the middle between these two, where the top and bottom thread, the purple and red thread in my case, are sort of pulling at each other with equal force. So the purple is not pulling all of the red to the top. The red is not pulling all of the purple to the bottom. I found this graphic online which really illustrates things a little bit more clearly. And it gets at how if the upper thread is too tight, it pulls the bottom thread up too much. If the upper thread is too loose, it will be pulled to the other side too much. And so the correct tension is somewhere in the middle. Listen, to the untrained eye, there's almost no difference at all between this top and bottom row. They look like the same stitch. When in fact, there's 9 levels in between them, and not even that, because look, I can do 1, I can do 1.5, I can do 1.9, I can do 2.1, because I can go in between the numbers too. At the end of the day, the difference is only as meaningful as the human eye can observe and discern. So isn't an exact science? Not really. What I usually end up doing is just throwing it somewhere in between that 3 to 5 range most of the time. But it is worth knowing what this dial does so that if you are working with a fabric that's extremely light or extremely heavy and you're noticing there's some gathering with the fabric around the seams, if the thread is like bubbling up and just looking really loose, you know that this is a place to go to fix that. So those are the main things to understand about your sewing machine. A couple of other considerations. This machine has a removable foot right here. This helps with sewing sleeves because I can wrap it around this. And this one also has a little compartment here for little bits and bobs that go with it. This right here is called a zipper foot. This allows the needle to get very close to the material that's working under the needle, so that if you're sewing a zipper, you can get very, very close to the zipper. But I'm thinking I'll make a dedicated video about zippers sometime in the future. This little guy is called a seam ripper, and this is going to be your best friend and your worst enemy. You will use this to undo any seams that you want to redo. Maybe you sew a garment and then you realize it doesn't fit properly, so you want to take out the stitches. I do this a lot if I have so much fabric on my workspace. Sometimes inadvertently a layer will come underneath the needle and I'll accidentally sew something to something else. And so the seam ripper is just a handy little tool that you slip into the stitches and it rips them. And then maybe get some tweezers and just pull the threads out. It's your best friend because it allows you to save your project without ruining your precious fabric, but it's also your worst enemy because if you're taking this out and using it, that means you did something wrong, right? One last thing I want to talk about before I go, because I think this video is getting too long now. I want to talk about the needle. Sometimes people ask me, Kai, do you recommend this machine if I want to sew with denim? Do you recommend this machine if I want to sew with leather? To some degree, it does depend on the machine. Some machines are more capable of working with sturdier fabrics, heavier fabrics. Sewing machines are heavy not because of the internal machinery that goes on inside, but because a heavy sewing machine will stay sturdy when you're sewing something that's a heavy-duty fabric like a denim or leather. So to some degree, it does depend on the machine, and some machines are better suited for that stuff. But I wanted to talk about the needle because you can actually interchange your needle, and you'll have to do this depending on what type of fabric you're sewing with. Depending on if you have a Singer machine or some other type of machine, you have to get needles that are designed for your machine so you can put in the right kind. This needle is, well, the labeling on it is 116, so it's a heavier duty needle. The standard needle that comes with this machine is a 9014, so these numbers are just labeling that come with the Singer machines, but depending on your machine, you have to buy needles that are fit for your machine. Even things like bobbins that go in here, your sewing machine will probably come with extra bobbins, but if you want to buy more, you have to buy ones that are fit for your sewing machine, so it all depends on the machine. I've told you in the beginning, I don't recommend this model in particular only because I haven't tried other ones, so I can't compare them to you. But it is worth noting that when you do want to buy an extra needle, when you want to buy other bobbins, when you want to buy accessories for your machine, maybe you want to take it into repair, it's maybe an advantage to have a machine that is from a popular brand like Singer or Brother. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're shopping for your very first machine. Singer and Brother aren't the only big brands out there. There's lots of other ones. Those are just the first two that came to mind. But you guys, that's pretty much all the information that I wanted to put in this video. So that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you liked it. I've had lots of these requests to do these more beginner-oriented videos, so I hope you guys learned a lot from this and that it was helpful. If it was, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. If you're thinking of buying your first machine, or if you've got one that totally intimidates you, hopefully this video gave you a little bit more confidence. You know, my commenters never fail to remind me that I'm not a professional. But we've all got something to learn, and we've all got something that we can teach other people. That's really what I believe. So I hope this video was a little bit helpful to you guys. If it was, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. But until I see you guys next time, I really hope you're all doing well, because I'm doing fabulous. Bye.